Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the second in our webinar series, From Stories to Evidence, Quantitative Patient Preference Information to Inform Product Development and Regulatory Reviews. We're delighted that you're able to join us, and we're pleased again to have Shelby Reed, Reed Johnson, and Juan Marcos Gonzalez to present the second in our three-part series on patient preference studies. Today we'll be focusing on example applications and lessons learned in instrument development. As with our previous series, this will be recorded and posted online, and you will receive an email with the link to the slides and the recording in the coming days. We encourage you to ask lots of questions, and we actually also have Martin Ho from CDRH to also answer any particular regulatory questions you may have with regards to patient preference for our presentation. So please use the Q&A box or the chat box to post your questions. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers for today.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is Juan Marcos Gonzalez. I will be the first speaker during today's session. Thank you all for attending today's session. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of ground to cover. And we decided to start this session by taking a step back and remind everyone about what we talked about last time. Specifically, we want to make sure that everyone's sort of on the same level when it comes to understanding what we mean by preferences. It's such a critical part, of course, of stated preference research, but it is, interestingly enough, a part that was only really defined in the way you see here fairly recently. This definition that you see here was part of the MDICx framework report published in 2015. And defines preferences as the qualitative or quantitative statements of the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes that differ among alternative interventions. And so very quickly, you will see here at the very beginning that we're talking both about qualitative and quantitative statements. We're going to focus today, and we have focused throughout the series on the quantitative components, but of course qualitative work to uncover and elicit patient preferences is also very critical in this process. We talk about preferences in terms of relative desirability or acceptability, and that is a very important part of this definition because preferences are not, cannot be interpreted in isolation. They depend upon what you are evaluating against the things that you're going to get with a treatment. And so in that sense, they're all about trade-offs and your willingness to accept such trade-offs when you're taking one treatment or accepting a medical technology over another. So in terms of the specific methods, we discussed this a little bit last time. Qualitative methods include focus groups and public meetings. They help us identify areas of concern, and they help us provide a context for the product development and regulatory decisions. In other words, it allows us to understand the context under which we should be eliciting specific pieces of information. There are simple quantitative methods that are also available. Most of them are used in the context of sort of broader efforts, not as the end product necessarily of preference-elicitation activity or research, typically seen in things like multi-criteria decision analysis, where it is important to understand as people in the exercise going through this multi-criteria decision analysis are interacting. It's important to understand where everyone is coming from, and so you can have these quick and simple quantitative methods to make those views more transparent and encourage discussion and consensus. And then there are more advanced quantitative methods, such as choice experiments and best-worst scaling, which are really designed to be the sort of the methods to provide preferences in its most refined form, if you will. They focus on obtaining measures of preferences that are as granular and as statistically significant as possible. And there are other methods, depending on which research question you have, you may use any of a variety of methods. Those are listed in several resources now, including the MDICx framework report that includes a catalog of quantitative methods for preference elicitation. But today we're going to focus on discrete choice experiments. It's just one type of these methods. Now, discrete choice experiments, discrete choice experiments are also known as choice-based conjoint analysis. It's just a type of conjoint analysis that focuses on choices to elicit patient preferences. Conjoint analysis, for those who don't know what that method stands for, is basically the idea that you can evaluate the value of a particular product based on the value of their components. And value, I use value here very loosely because conjoint analysis actually goes beyond economics, which is the discipline, of course, that you would associate with the idea of eliciting value. And it is actually used to measure other constructs other than preferences. In discrete choice experiments, we build alternatives in the spirit of conjoint analysis. We build alternatives that are described in terms of their features, and we call these features attributes. Of this, alternatives could be treatments, they could be policies, they could be different types of interventions. But in essence, we try to make the comparison across alternatives uniform by talking about the same features and how each of these alternatives perform under each of these features. The underlying assumption under the use of discrete choice experiments is that preferences or choices between these alternatives will depend upon the relative importance of the features. In other words, the end product of the alternative is just the aggregation of the value of the different features that are presented for each alternative. And then respondents signal that relative preferences through their choices between these hypothetical alternatives. We use statistical analysis to link the patterns of choices between these alternatives and the characteristics of the features that were presented under each alternative. And through repeated observations, we're able to estimate what we call preference weights, which indicates the intensity of preference for each of the features in the study. Now, this is an example discrete choice experiment question. As you can see here, we have 4 columns. The first one lists the features or attributes that are studied with this specific experiment. This is an example choice question from a Parkinson study that was published in 2017, looking at different alternatives to deal with Parkinson's symptoms. In this case, you can see that we're presenting 2 device options and an oral medication alternative. Under each of these device alternatives, you can see a description of how these devices perform under each of the attributes. And so respondents were given the opportunity to select either a medicine pump, a brain stimulator, or an oral medicine. As I said before, the pattern of choices as people see different alternatives across questions is what tells us how important each of the features and changes across alternatives in each of the features are. Let's continue. Now, discrete choice experiments are not new. They've been around for a long while. They were developed in market research, transportation economics, environmental economics, and more recently in health applications as well. Now, it's been, as I said, just more recently used in health, but it has a long history, and a lot of the things that we're seeing now applied in health economics have been used already in previous applications in these different areas. It was actually the product of Dan McFadden at the University of Berkeley, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000, in the year 2000 for the conceptual and statistical foundations for the method. And I think that part of the renewed interest in this method to elicit preferences in recent times is because of increased interest in patient-centered healthcare and interest in the use of these methods for regulatory support. Move ahead. Okay. So speaking of regulatory interest in these methods, back in 2016, almost 2 years now, the Center for Devices in Radiological Health issued final guidance on the use of these methods, or really the guidance on the incorporation of patient preference information for regulatory review. And in this document, first of all, it was the first of its kind, so it was quite an accomplishment, and it includes information on sort of recommendations for collecting patient preferences. The FDA reviews de novo requests for evaluations of devices, and recommendations for including patient preference information in labeling. At this point, submission of this information is voluntary. Nevertheless, it's generated quite a bit of interest, and so that's part of the reason why we're talking about these methods today. Hopefully inform people on how to be able to use these methods for that very same purpose. Now, there are a lot of resources out there that you could use to sort of get your feet wet in this area. ISPOR has a series of checklist reports, or sorry, task force reports. You have the links to those reports on the screen right now. And MDIC, as I mentioned before, issued a report talking about a framework for the use of this information in benefit-risk evaluations specifically, and a catalog of the different methods available to quantify patient preferences. Now, for this meeting, this session, we're going to actually leverage one of the ISPOR reports, or task force reports. The very first one of these reports included a checklist that was intended to help new practitioners to be able to conduct these studies in kind of a step-by-step approach to doing this work, specifically for conjoint analysis and discrete-choice experiments. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover a portion of this checklist, the portion that relates to instrument development. And during the third session, we will discuss the remaining points in the checklist. Let's get started with point number one, which is research question. And this is, of course, not specific to discrete-choice experiments or stated preference research or health preference research. This is just the basis for research. In order to conduct research, you need to have a research question. And so the considerations here are no different from what you would have to think about as you are defining any other kind of research. What is the study perspective? Who is going to be involved in the research in terms of the populations that are going to be targeted, in terms of the people who are going to facilitate the research? What exactly is it that you want to accomplish with this research, and why is that important? The second point here is perhaps a little bit more important or perhaps particularly important in the context of preference research, decision-making context, because it refers really to two things. It refers to the fact that you need to evaluate the context in which this information will be used so that you can really craft a research question that is relevant to address whatever issues you're trying to address. But it also means that that context is likely going to influence how you're going to frame the experiment, which in the case of preference research, it's well documented, matters in terms of the type of preference information that you obtain. So it's not just about the design, it's potentially also about the type of results and how you interpret the results that you get with this kind of research. Tractability, can you answer the question with the methods available? Sometimes that's pretty obvious, sometimes it isn't. In this case, I think that it would be wise for you to discuss that specific point with expert researchers if there's any question. There are very sophisticated methods out there, but of course there's a limit to what we can ask people to do, and often we find that the limiting factor is not necessarily the method, but really that people can't process information in a way that is consistent with what we need them to do to tease out preferences for specific things. So that's of course important. And then feasibility, whether you have the time, the resources, and of course the expertise to be able to do good work that really produces ultimately evidence that can be considered by the FDA in regulatory reviews. Now, I want to kind of provide a few examples of research questions, because the idea of a research question can be a little abstract. And so you could think about perhaps what is the relative importance of pain versus heart attack risks if you are considering a technology that could affect both of these endpoints. This is very much, the first one is very much a benefit-risk type of question. You could look at equivalences, so not only what is the relative importance, but what is sort of the exchange rate between different aspects of your research or your problem. One example would be to think about money equivalences or willingness to pay, say, for effective treatment or for treatment in situations where options are limited. You can also consider not just averages, but focus on how preferences vary across members of a specific population, and evaluate what may be driving those differences in terms of personal characteristics or even attitudes. You can also look at instruments that are meant to, say, qualify health-related quality of life. A lot of these instruments are built with multiple dimensions, these PRO instruments, which means they are aggregating dimensions that may not have the same importance from a patient perspective, and so the simple aggregation approach of the instrument may be misleading in terms of how a specific change in quality of life would be affecting a patient. And so adding preference information to weight those different dimensions can help tailor that information in a patient-centric way. We can also look at possible uptake information. So what is the chance that people who are offered different treatment alternatives would go for specific alternatives, depending on the characteristics of that alternative. That's something that we actually explore in the weight loss device world, and it's of course related to the value of the characteristics, but it goes one step beyond by trying to explain intensity of preferences, not just as a bundle of importances related to the characteristics of the treatment or the individual importances for the characteristics of the treatment, but rather as a bundle, and how these all of these characteristics interact in a specific medical technology. And finally, an area that is actually not being explored very frequently, but potentially has there are some opportunities of research, is to look at actual behavior, health behaviors, and evaluate adherence to different treatments based on patient preferences for the outcomes of those treatments. Now, once you define your research question, the next point is to consider what is it that you need to be able to answer that question. So what is the evidence that you need to answer the research question that you've defined? And so our recommendation here is to be as specific as possible. And often, and I would say personally, it should be done as often as possible. There should be a formal presentation of a hypothesis, because it gives you a very clear, well-defined target when you're defining or deciding what is the kind of evidence that you need to answer the question, your research question. Now, I wanted to kind of share some example hypotheses based on the example research questions that we already discussed, and showed you explicitly what would be the kind of evidence that you would want to collect in order to test that hypothesis and answer the research question ultimately. So first hypothesis, you can think about reducing the severity of dyspnea from moderate to severe, or rather from severe to moderate, and evaluate whether that improvement is more important than a 3% chance of pneumonia or any other sort of adverse event. For that question, that's a benefit-risk question, and you would want to understand what is the importance of these two changes. One is the improvement in efficacy, the other one is the improvement in, or the worsening of the chance of risk. Now, another type of question you could set up as a hypothesis is whether more than 75% of patients, they would accept a 5% increase in the chance of bleeding to improve physical functioning. And this is more about the distribution of preferences, less about the average, say, trade-offs that respondents would be willing to make between these endpoints. And so there you need some measure of dispersion of the, not just the average, but the dispersion of the importance of these efficacy changes and the risks associated with these efficacy changes. Finally, you could look at sort of evaluating a prioritization, really, and determining what is the most important improvement that a particular technology can provide to patients. And of course, that wouldn't necessarily require trade-offs. In such a case, you would be okay just eliciting the ranking of the importances among the treatment benefits. So once you've defined the research question, hopefully you have the opportunity and are able to define a hypothesis and the type of evidence you need to answer or test that hypothesis. You start building the instrument that is going to lead you to obtaining those evidence, those data. And so for that, you would start by thinking specifically about the attributes and levels. And again, Discrete-Choice experiments is based on the idea that you're defining alternatives in terms of their features. So the features that you include are really important. Oh. And actually, I'm going to pass the baton here as you're talking about the attribute selection to Shelby Reed, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the decisions to include and how to consider attributes and levels for DCEs.
Well, thanks so much, Juan Marcos. Now that we've clearly specified our research question, we've answered the why, who, and what, we'll get down to some of the nuts and bolts that are required when we're conducting one of these preference studies. So you've already seen examples of attributes. I think you probably know that they represent the different features. We provide examples here from transportation planning where an attribute might represent different features of a car, the vehicle type and its color, and then the levels are just variations within each of those features. And so when we apply that to healthcare, we think about treatment attributes. These attributes need to be clinically relevant. And many times we'll look to a clinical trial, what has generated the most evidence in terms of the effectiveness of a drug, to tie it back. Particularly for regulatory decision making, it's important to tie back the attributes representing effectiveness to the endpoints used in a clinical trial. We hope that those endpoints are salient to respondents. There are measures like HbA1c levels that may not be salient to many respondents. So we have to think about that and ensure whether patients can make trade-offs with regard to attributes they understand. When we say that attributes must be outside the respondent's control, what we mean here is that we can't impart feelings on patients. We can't say, you're going to be very happy with one treatment or not happy with another treatment, or depressed or not depressed, or anxious or not anxious. Okay, so these have to be sort of attributes of the treatment and what they can provide. And the way that people internalize those features is sort of up to them. And that's what they express when they're choosing one alternative or another. The attributes must be at least be conceivable that they can vary independently. We have an example where physical functioning might improve, but a patient might experience more hospitalizations. And so because they must vary in a discrete choice experiment independently, people have to be able to accept that different combinations can exist. And so to sort of kind of deconstruct those relationships for people, we provide some descriptions about how these different things can move together or move in opposite ways to help them understand that. And then the levels, in terms of selecting the levels, we'll get into this a little bit later, but they need to be wide enough to encourage trade-off, and we need to consider those values or percentages that are represented in the clinical evidence. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Again, just in the terms of attributes that we select for health applications, we think about efficacy endpoints, moderate to mild side effects, and then to evaluate risk tolerance, we select severe adverse events, some of which may be known before a product is tested, and some which may not be known, but we select them as placeholders, typically choosing something that is severe so that we can be conservative in our estimates of risk tolerance. And so what I mean by that is if someone's willing to accept a risk of death, then they would be willing to accept many other adverse outcomes. Okay, in terms of identifying and choosing the attributes, I had mentioned earlier, typically we'll look to clinical trial endpoints and adverse events that have been identified. In some cases, it may be a PRO, patient-reported outcome, that is being used in a clinical trial. And we'll select different items from those PRO instruments. There are also cases when we may not know what the attributes should necessarily be, and we'll use a bottom-up approach, identifying attributes that are important from the patient perspective. And there are lots of different sources that we can use to identify attributes. And we may use a combination of the different sources shown here. In terms of choosing levels for the attributes, there's a little bit of debate in regard to choosing levels for adverse events. We want to ensure that we have, in the case of risk, high enough risk that will make people stop and choose an alternate medication or device because the risks are too high. If patients are they're never really swayed by the risk level shown, we don't know what their maximum acceptable risk is for a given level of benefit. On the other hand, the debate is, well, does it really matter if we know what their maximum acceptable risk is if the clinically relevant range, if the regulatory relevant range is much less than that? Would we rather, kind of constrict our levels to a more clinically relevant range where we would have more precision around trade-off at that level. That's something that we would talk through as a study team and determine what would be most appropriate for a given study. In terms of the number of levels for attributes, usually 2 to 5. Any more than that is too much. Even 5 is really the upper limit. And then for numeric attributes like risk levels, we could include a minimum of 2 levels, in which case we would only be able to draw a straight line between those utility weights that would come out of the study. If we have 3 levels, then we can at least draw a curved line or a quadratic relationship across 3 levels of an attribute. And then for categorical attributes, this might be different types of devices. We use the relevant number of categories based on, availability on the market. Here's an example of attributes and corresponding levels that were used in the weight loss device studies that the FDA worked through with Juan Marcos and Reed. The attribute levels, or sorry, the labels are shown here. That's another issue that we've worked on to provide enough information there, but not too much, so that it can serve as a memory aid to our respondents. In this case, there were 3 to 5 levels for each of the attributes. Combinations of numerical attributes as well as categorical attribute levels. Now getting into constructing the choice tasks. As we've discussed, there are lots of different options here. One is how many alternatives to show at one time. The easiest case and the most common is showing 2 alternatives. There are some cases where we have to show more, particularly when there's an opt-out or status quo. And that is a patient can just stick with their current treatment. Maybe their condition isn't so bad that they have to make a choice between new treatments or new surgeries or devices. In regard to label or unlabeled alternatives, these can be useful or necessary actually when patients sort of associate or know about a given device and maybe what its features are, and we want to be able to take that into account as sort of a separate element of a utility that people may have a positive preference for or a negative preference for, and if we want to be able to back that out or add it in, we need to account for it separately. We've talked about how much information to include in the attribute labels. We'd like to limit the information so that we can allow participants to really focus on the alternatives shown in the choice task. And the decision frame, we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of, what is motivating this choice. Again, that relates back to the study question as well, the research question. In terms of how many choice tasks to require a participant to answer, we have to consider how complex those choice tasks are. And this is really a multi-variable type of decision where we have to consider the complexity of the attributes, the number of the attributes, and how many different alternatives are shown in a given choice task. So most of the time, people try to have between 5 or 6 attributes, no more than that, but then maximum would be about 8. It's quite difficult for people to take into account 8 or more attributes at one time. And what we would push people towards doing if we had too many is they'll use heuristics. They'll just basically gloss over some of the attributes and not consider them in the decisions they make. We talked about the number of alternatives. Typically, each respondent is asked to complete 5 to 10 choice tasks, again, depending on their complexity. Survey instrument doesn't just start out with a choice task. We really have to warm people up. We have to make sure that they're ready to tackle those choice tasks to provide good, thoughtful information. So typically we start with a brief consent. These are obviously low-risk studies, but it's good practice to include an informed consent form. The attribute descriptions, we'll go through those. They need to be clear to patients. It's patient-friendly language. One of the first sort of concerns that people bring up in regard to these studies will say people don't understand risk. They don't understand what a 15% risk is or a 50% risk. And we acknowledge that people have difficulty with numeracy. So we include what we call a risk tutorial. Reid will show you one of those. We include some practice choice questions just to get people warmed up so they can understand sort of what's going on in the choice task. We ask questions about their comprehension in regard to the attribute descriptions. Then they go through the meat of the survey instrument where they answer those different choice questions. And then they're totally taxed and tired, then we ask some of the easy background questions. And we ask those at the end just partly just not to influence their choices that they've made and to use most of their energy on the harder questions. Okay, so the FDA refers to well-informed respondents in terms of them providing preference information that's going to be relevant for regulatory decision-making. The information that respondents have has to be sufficient so that they can evaluate the trade-off questions accurately. Including something does not ensure that respondents will understand it or consider it. There is a maximum capacity of new information that respondents can take on when they're doing one of these studies. So we want to provide them with sufficient information, but maybe not, everything that we can think of, because we don't want to overload them. We need to ensure that the attribute descriptions are clinically accurate, but written at a low reading level. And we will sometimes go back and forth with the clinicians who we work with in regard to the patient-friendly language that we like to use versus the clinically accurate and jargon that they use every day in their practice. So, this also will vary depending on how experienced patients are. And so, we have to just be careful that we're using language that can extend to the broadest range of patients. We might agree that, 75 or 85% of patients understand various medical terms, but we really want to ensure that we can go up to nearly 100%. So that's why we'll use language that might appear to be rather elementary to some. In terms of cognitive overload, I've mentioned before, more is not necessarily better, and we like mama bear right in the middle. Okay, here's an example that we use to represent physical functioning. In one study, we have a description at the top, describes people might feel tired, out of breath as they do their daily activities. Then we tell them that later they're going to use this information to try to impart on them that they really need to take in to try to absorb this information. So what we do is we can provide this table, but then we go through some additional questions to ask about their comprehension. So they begin to internalize this information that's shown. PRO type of question, we're asking them how their level of physical function relates to their ability to do daily activities, just to allow them to, kind of consider those different levels in their own context. And then the quiz type question is more reading comprehension, or how well do they remember those different levels. And we recognize that in that particular example that we showed, there was a lot of information. So, and we found that actually we included those different levels right in the choice task itself as a memory aid. I'm going to turn it over to Reed now to go through some of this tough stuff about barriers to valid preference data.
Yeah, everything up to now was easy, right? Yeah, there are lots of criticisms of stated preference data. I think many of them are well-founded. In particular, there is a concern about hypothetical bias. Do people do what they say they would do? Shelby has already mentioned the challenge of numeracy. And we're asking them to do something that they normally would not do in a survey. This is a pretty hard task that we're asking them to do. And we just have to help them as much as we can and not assume that, yeah, it's easy, which it isn't. Let's take a look at this, the use of risk attributes. The truth is that uncertainty is just simply a fact of life in healthcare. And we just don't know, in many cases, what outcomes are going to be for any given patient. Some people say that because it's hard and people are kind of dumb about probabilities, that we just can't ask people these questions. But the truth is that most people are averse to risk. That is, they are willing to accept worse efficacy to avoid risks. And if that's the case in real life, then we need to try to, as best we can, to replicate that and capture the value of that risk aversion in a state preference survey. But introducing risk attributes into a survey significantly increase the choice difficulty and have implications for how many questions we can ask, how many attributes we can include, how many levels. It feeds back into the basic survey design things we've already talked about. Okay, so people didn't learn fifth grade fractions, and they need help. So, I hope nobody, I hate it when people go back to one of my old surveys and say, wait a minute, you did it this way, why are you saying something different now? Well, it's because we've learned a lot, and we continually rethink what we're doing, and every time we interview patients, we get new insights into how to make this work better. For the last 2 or 3 years, we have been defining risks in terms of the available evidence, which we think more accurately represents the way information, the kind of information that actually is available to both clinicians and patients in making a treatment decision. So I've colored in this text here. Doctors do not know who will have a serious problem. That is, we are not going to tell you what your own personal risk is. We don't know. However, based on their experience with large numbers of patients, doctors know how many people have had a serious problem after receiving a device. That information can help you think about your own chance of having a serious problem. That's it. That's all we're going to do here. Sometimes we ask people at the end whether they thought their own chances would be higher or lower than the risks we showed them, to get some idea of how they're adjusting population risks for their own circumstances. By and large, they will say, yeah, they probably would be about the same as the average, but often they have information, maybe about family history, that might cause them to adjust the averages up or down. So we're going to show some pictures. These are called icon arrays. It is, by and large, accepted good practice for showing probabilistic information. And we explain to them what the colors mean. We emphasize the colors that are blue are people who have had a problem, and 96% have not had a serious problem. It's important to emphasize both the positive and negative outcomes that are shown in the graphic. And then we don't assume that they got it, so we'll ask them 2 or 3 questions where we ask them to actually read off the information that's in the graphic. And if they get it wrong, it gives us a chance to reinforce the approach we're using here and repeat how to interpret it correctly. We then use the information from these answers later on in the analysis to control for people who had trouble just with the basic idea of proportions of a population. So we have to set up the decision context. It's called the decision frame. One of the criticisms we often hear is that you can manipulate people's answers by changing the frame. The most common well-known phenomenon is if you explain an outcome as a gain or a loss. If you describe it as a gain, they will answer exactly the same question differently than if you characterize it as a loss. That's exactly right. There's a huge, huge amount of both experimental and observational literature that people's perception of the benefits and advantages and disadvantages of various options depends on how you frame the question. So we have to choose a frame. And by choosing the frame, we realize that we are influencing the results. So if we have to choose a frame, because frames are in every decision you make in real life, then we should pick a frame that is clinically relevant. That is, it's the kind of frame that the patient actually might encounter in making a treatment decision. So here's an example. Suppose you're not able to do most of your daily activities, blah, blah, blah. Your doctor suggests that you consider 2 devices. These devices have different effects. You could also decide not to have a device, and if you make that decision, you wouldn't be able to do your daily activities. So we're setting this up. The patient, it may not be true that the patient is not able to do most of his or her daily activities. That is, they may be have a milder condition. But in order to get them to evaluate the trade-offs, we're going to show them changes that all of them will be better than not being able to do most of your daily activities. So we get them to evaluate the full range of outcomes of interest to us. If we started with a patient who actually has pretty good function, then we would never be able to show them a deterioration in their function and get them to take that seriously. So right at the beginning, we ask them to put themselves in a situation where they may or may not be in order to motivate the decision that we're asking them to evaluate. Pushing the wrong buttons here. There we go. Okay, so then we give them a little simple 2-attribute question just to get them some practice in thinking about trade-offs using this particular format. So in this case, it's just the limitations of activities and mortality risk. And the question is, which would you choose if these were the only alternatives available to you? We might do 2 or even 3 of those practice questions before we show them the final, the first question that we're going to actually collect data for them. Years back, we used to just define all the attributes and then start asking these questions. And in pretest interviews, there was a deer in the headlights reaction when they first see this task layout. But if they build up, they do 2 alternatives, then 3, and they sort of get used to the idea, then when they actually have to start giving us data, we reduce the amount of learning associated with the beginning of the question sequence. Now, we have a problem with hypothetical bias. There is a technique that originated in game theory, where the negotiator attempts to influence the outcomes of the negotiation without giving up anything. And the example of this is when you're haggling in a third world country over price, and the person who's selling you something says, I can't sell it for anything less than that. I have 3 children, I have 4 children, I have 5 children, I have 10 children at home who are going to starve if I don't sell this at the higher price. So that's called cheap talk. You're not giving up anything, but you're trying to change the behavior of a person. There are a number of experiments in stated preference applications, both in health and other areas, that has demonstrated that a simple cheap talk before text, before people answer the questions, results in better data. People are more attentive, and we get tighter confidence intervals. So this is the way it can work. This is a text that we, variations on this that we've used a number of times. So basically, we tell people that there's a problem with hypothetical bias in our studies. So right there, we're kind of sharing the problem we're trying to solve and making the respondent a member of the research team. That is, we trust you to be able to tell you a problem that we have and ask you to help us fix it. Because our participants do not actually have to live with the results of the treatment they select, they often do not think carefully about what they would do if they really had to choose. If you do not pay attention to the information shown on each question as you would in real life, we will not get a true measure of how important various treatment benefits and risks actually are to people like you. So we need your thoughtful answers to help us understand how you feel about possible medical devices. A cheap fix. It doesn't fix everything, but it improves the quality of the data. Okay, interviews. I always go into these interviews wishing I didn't have to spend my time doing this, and I go out of the interviews thankful, grateful that someone made me sit down and across the table from a patient or several patients and listen to them as they're trying to fill out our survey. So typically we would interview 10 to 12 respondents, maybe up to 15 or 20, depending on how well the first few interviews go. We use what's called a think aloud protocol. That is, they read the survey and answer it as they go along, and then they express out loud whatever is coming through their mind as they're reading and thinking about answering the questions. Sometimes we have to keep reminding them, now what are you thinking now? And what did you think when you were answering that question? Here's some possible probes. After they pick one of the alternatives, we ask, well, why did you choose A? Or if they seem to stumble in an attribute definition, we might ask them, well, how could we make that clearer for you? Or if we didn't hear anything after they got some information, we might ask them what their reaction was to that information. Then we do what's called bidding games. So suppose they pick alternative B. Then pick one of the levels, one of the attributes, and say, what if efficacy level in alternative A were twice as large? Would you switch from B to A? They say yes. Then we would say, well, what if it were only 50% better? Would you switch there? Yes. What if it was just 10% better? No, I wouldn't switch. So we do that to try to get some sense of where the thresholds are, whether we're getting the range of attribute levels wide enough or narrow, or maybe they're too wide, to make sure that we're showing people ranges over which we would actually observe trade-off behavior. The point of the interviews is not to collect data, but to refine the instrument. So when we encounter a clear problem after maybe only 1 or 2 interviews, we fix it. We don't keep replicating that problem. If we're pretty sure other people are going to have that problem, we fix it. and then the next respondent really sees a different version. As I say, we're not collecting data here, so we're not worried about that. We're into fixing problems as we identified. All right, a very quick introduction to experimental design. I'm going to use an example I borrowed from Jordan Louvier. Chicken soup, or soup, okay. It could be chicken or beef soup, or it could have noodles or not noodles, or it could have vegetables or not vegetables, all right? So our attributes are meat, noodles, and vegetables. We have 2 levels of each. So here are all the possible soup recipes that you could generate from those ingredients. There are 8 soup recipes. There's no more and no less. 8. That shows all of the, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but chicken can occur 2 ways, with either noodles or with noodles, and then with vegetables or not, and then without noodles, with vegetables or not. Similarly for beef. So these are all of this. This is a full factorial, or all the possible combinations. Now here's the problem we have in stated preference surveys. Most DCEs are too large to use the full factorial. So suppose we had 4 attributes, that's modest. One has 4 levels, one has 3 levels, one has 5. That might be a categorical attribute. And then one just has 2. Well, what's the full factorial? It is 4 times 3 times 5 times 2. It's 120 possible outcome profiles or choice profiles. That's way too many for people to evaluate. It's even worse when we look at all the possible duples or all the possible pairs. There are over 7,000 possible questions we could ask. All right, so that would be nice, but we need to be able to ask a finite number of questions that people are really able to answer within the time that they're willing to donate to us. So fortunately, there's algorithmic magic that we can apply. There's software that is readily available in SAS and other programs that will construct efficient, meaning designs that yield the most precise estimates for a given number of questions, or given the precision that we're aiming for, make sure we can get that precision with the fewest number of questions. Unfortunately, we have some conflicting objectives. With simple designs, we can improve the reliability of the subject's response. That is, this isn't just about statistical efficiency, it's also about measurement error. We could have an extremely efficient design, but it's so hard for people to answer, we're going to get crap for data. Also, the sponsors of our studies often want very granular data. That is, they want to learn a lot about a lot. In order to do that, you need high-resolution designs. But high-resolution designs makes the task harder and increases measurement error. So what I say in almost every study in one of the first meetings is we have to choose. You can learn a lot about a little, or you can learn a little about a lot, but you can't learn a lot about a lot. It's a hard decision, and there's a lot of back and forth between sponsors and the researchers to get this right. The design is not just about statistical efficiency. It has to make sense. So, for example, the algorithm may not pay any attention to implausible combinations. It's just doing full factorials. So you could have a combination that shows, I can't remember what Shelby's example was, but it shows a very high level of pain and also a very low level of restrictions on activities of daily living. Well, that just makes no sense. Now, there are researchers who would say, well, that's what the experimental design software produced, and we're going to go ahead with it. But in our group, at least, we think that showing people implausible combinations, besides creating a an impossible sort of task for people to answer, which means that they're going to have to somehow interpret the question differently than we asked, I think it undermines their confidence that we know what we're doing. But every time you remove an implausible combination from the full factorial, or from the partial factorial, efficient factorial, you create some correlation in the experimental design that could have consequences for analysis. The other thing that can happen in the algorithmic design is that there may be dominated alternatives. There are tricks for preventing the design from doing that, but if you just run a standard program, often it will generate alternatives where everything in one alternative is better than in the other alternative. We often use that as a test of internal validity test. We'll talk about that in the next meeting of this series. In any case, we learn nothing about preferences. If people are paying attention, everybody's going to agree whether their preferences are different or not if you show them a dominated alternative. Now, even with an efficient design, we're going to end up with more questions than any one respondent can answer. So we might end up with, let's say, 40 choice questions, and we can't ask any one person 40 questions. So we might block that into 4 versions of 10 questions. Now, the problem is that when we there's a couple of problems with this. One is when we just chop these up into random groups of 10, sometimes we can get funny combination of questions. That is, there's a set of questions that only show the worst level of one of the attributes, never shows anything else. That can happen if you just pull out 4 questions, a subset of questions. So we have to make sure that the level balance is, we can't get it perfect, but we don't want it to be too dramatically different. The other concern we have has to do with making sure that these versions are administered an equal number of times. We'll talk about that again, and that also in the next webinar. So in the next webinar, we are going to deal with these, this transition between designing an instrument and getting data from it. We'll talk about statistical analysis of the data and how to interpret it, what results and conclusions we can obtain from statistical estimates of relative importance weights. And we'll talk about steady presence and, good thing my time is running out here. My mouth has stopped working. And different ways of presenting study results to different audiences. These results can be pretty complex, but often we have pretty simple stories that are embedded in it, and Juan Marcos and I have to restrain ourselves or get help from Martin or Shelby or somebody in boiling things down to what we've really learned. All right, so we have some time here for questions. We'd be happy to go back and talk about anything that we went through a little too quickly for you. We aren't seeing the questions, but somebody I think is monitoring them. Someone's looking for us.
So this is Dan with MDIC. I'm looking for the questions, but I'm going to field one out there for you guys while I'm doing that. So I thought it was really interesting as part of the choice experiments that you guys, I saw at least on one of the examples that cost of the treatment, right, was incorporated or can be incorporated. And so my question was off of that, have you guys had or do you know of successes where that information along, obviously, with the therapeutic or outcome-based has been used or utilized either by private or public payers in terms of making any coverage decisions?
Well, it's not the first time we've heard that question.
Fair enough.
One Marcus and I actually came from a different applied economics field doing stated preference methods there, which was environmental economics. And the Reagan administration, in fact, required that for all major, new major regulations, a benefit cost analysis had to be done. And we were trying to value clean water, clean air, endangered species, things for which there is no market data whatsoever. And much of the early development of the methods we are currently using in health was done in environmental economics in this non-market valuation context. So there was an enormous amount of research that was done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s trying to obtain valid estimates of willingness to pay for things that people do not really either pay for with money or pay for in ways that don't really reflect their actual willingness to pay. So we kind of thought when we started doing health that we'd just keep doing that. Then we found out that nobody cared about that. And so you'll notice that very few of our examples include cost. We do include cost from time to time, and we have used much of what we learned from environmental economics in the way we craft the cost attribute. But in terms of its interest, we are currently doing some vaccine studies where cost, in fact, is going to play an important role to the extent that people have some co-pays. New vaccines may not be completely covered. New vaccines may be a lot more expensive than old vaccines. We did a study of HPV vaccines about 7 or 8 years ago before they were widely covered. And we're able to do a pretty good job of predicting uptake in the early years of the HPV vaccine availability. I can't say that, I want to check. In terms of payers in general for either devices or pharmaceuticals, I think we kind of run the risk of going to a payer with a willingness to pay study and having the payer say, if they're willing to pay for it, let them.
Interesting. Yep.
So I think we're better off going to a payer with stated preference evidence on adherence rather than on willingness to pay.
Right.
Because adherence is cost saving for the payer.
Right.
And of course, we do a terrible job at figuring out adherence and predicting it. Yeah, well, Marcos, that was on our list. We have done a number of adherence studies. We're looking forward to doing more of them and figuring out how to do it better.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's really interesting. Obviously, I mean, and I agree. It's not a point I had thought about, but as you brought up adherence, you know, obviously the hope of that is the long-term cost would be lower, not only for the patients and the insurers, but for the care system as well. So that's a really interesting way to get at that issue. I appreciate that. One of the other questions was just around availability. So yes, the deck and the webinar is being recorded, so that will be available after the fact. Other questions that folks might have? Let me just pull this up. Further about considerations, and let me see if I can get that full question up. I might need to adjust my question box here. further consider, my chat question is, I'm just going to take this off the screen a bit so I can look at the Q&A a little bit closer.
I can ask the question.
Thanks.
Do you mind a bit more the options to identify attributes where the medical product in question is hypothetical or in early development stages?
Great question. I mean, I think the idea would be, of course, there has to be some sense of what is going to, what the technology is going to be accomplishing. I think the impact of being early in the development of a product and trying to complete one of these studies may be reflected in two areas. Number one, in the attributes, of course, what things you want to include in there. But number two, in terms, even among the things that you know ought to be included, you may not know the levels, the appropriate levels to include in it. So typically, I would have to assume that in devices, you would have, and pharmaceuticals would be the same, you would have a better sense about what you hope your device would accomplish, and perhaps not so clear of a sense about what other unintended consequences it might have. So in that sense, one of the things we've recommended in the past is if you have to or are interested in developing something early on, is to try to choose either a very severe type of adverse event or negative impact of the technology. And on the level side, try to choose broad levels or broad ranges so that, number one, you can at least measure the relative impact of the benefits of your product against something that will likely be more harmful than what you're going to end up observing. And number two, so that your range of levels encompasses whatever, has a good chance of encompassing whatever actual levels, whatever the actual levels end up being, whatever the clinical evidence is on the attributes that you include.
Yeah, one of the real advantages of stated preference methods is that we're not stuck with the data. That is, we can kind of speculate what might be a problem. Now, I can tell you what will happen when we suggest that you do exactly what Juan Marcos said. There will be a clinician sitting at the table who's saying, we are not going to suggest that we have a risk of instantaneous death, spontaneous death, that we suspect that this is a problem. That will kill our product if you do that. So, you know, on the one hand, I think we need to kind of educate people about what hypothetical means and what the advantages of sort of, as Shelby pointed out, staking out something. If we're not sure, it's better to stake out something that's more severe than we expect, so that we can always say, well, look at how much risk that people are willing to tolerate for that, and our product doesn't come anywhere near that.
Right. I mean,
so we make an even stronger case that, in fact,
I think there's also, I think it's important to perhaps take a step back and think about what you would be using these methods for under such a circumstance. If you wanted to evaluate benefit risks, comparisons of benefits and risks with these methods, really, to be perfectly honest, you would want to be further along, because part of it is, of course, understanding the types of risks involved, but also getting a sense of what are the clinically relevant levels for those risks. So, to be perfectly honest, I think using these methods for benefit-risk evaluations early on in the process is probably not a good use of these methods. Well, now you could, however, learn about number one, what people might want to understand about these devices. So if there's a trial design, if you're thinking about trial design, you could use these methods to try to understand what should be included in the trial, even before you know what's going to be the incidence of any of these endpoints.
Well, okay, and the other application we've the other approach we've used for early product development is a prioritization. Right. Now, you can use a DCE for prioritization, or you can use other methods. But stated preference methods can help. And in fact, in at least one case, it had a profound impact on, one of our studies had a profound impact on product development decision-making for, and this has all been published, for Fragile X syndrome.
I was just going to add a third application of these types of studies earlier in product development, and that is, sort of in addition or based on the prioritization, you might find that there are a few endpoints that are important to patients. And in clinical trials, as many of you know, composite endpoints are frequently used to gain more statistical power. To the extent that the endpoints that are included in a composite can be weighted according to relative importance based on patient preference data, one can develop a weighted composite endpoint and use that as a basis for the endpoint in clinical trials.
This is Man Ho from the FDA. I wanted to second what the speaker has just mentioned. And on the top of that, if we are using the patient preference information to interpret the clinical trial results, as we know, we have the evidence of knowing the benefits and risks from clinical studies, but how can we weigh the benefits and risks? Therefore, it's very important that when we are choosing or designing these attributes and level, they correspond to the endpoint, the major endpoints that we study in the clinical study, so that when both the results are coming back, the clinical studies and the preference studies, we can map to determine what are the trade-off between the benefits and risks being shown in the clinical studies. So when it comes to the timing, I think the preference study is relatively flexible to be done. It can be done as long as that the preference, as long as the clinical studies, the study protocol has been stabilized or stable, so that we are, as the previous speaker had mentioned, among these clinical endpoints, we can choose some that are relevant and meaningful to patients, and then we can formulate them. So therefore, I mean, we can also do it, during the clinical study as ongoing or afterwards. But I mean, the stated preference method has the flexibility of doing a range of benefits and risks. So therefore, it does not have to be exactly we does not have to know exact the estimate of these benefits and risks, but we need to make sure the range covers the specific outcome that occurred in the clinical studies. Thank you.
Are we done?
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I want to thank you all for joining us today. And as a reminder, our third and final webinar in this patient preference series will take place on April 19th, where we'll talk about analysis and reporting. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.